The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zer0 Books podcast. Peter Hudis is a professor of the Humanities at Oakton Community College. He is the author of several books, including Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism and Marx and the Third World, New Perspectives on Writings from His Last Decade. He is also a member of the International Marxist Humanist organization and the guest on this week's podcast. It's September 20th, 2018, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zer0 Books and the host of this podcast. I want to remind listeners that Zer0 Books produces 2 podcasts every week, one for free and one for people who support us on Patreon. We also run a YouTube channel featuring video essays from myself and other members of the Zer0 Books team, and we have just started a Zer0 Books reading group. The next book on our reading list will be Stuart Walton's Neglected or Misunderstood, Introducing Theodore Adorno. Patrons who support us at $15 a month will receive access to the ebook later today, but you can sign up and still receive it later. The music you're listening to right now is Bill Brown and his Brownies' 1927 hit Hot Lips. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Peter Hudis and I discuss the revolutionary subject under capitalism. I'm wanting to talk to you sort of as a follow-up to attending your panel at the Left Forum a while back. And but before I jump into that, maybe I can just get you to tell me a little bit about yourself and about the International Marxist Humanist organization.
Sure. I'm a longtime Marxist humanist. I first discovered the work of Marxist humanism in the late 70s when I was an independent activist in New York City, where I grew up. And over a number of years of being dissatisfied with other left alternatives that I encountered, I came across the works of Raya Donetskaya and other thinkers in the Marxist humanist tradition, and became associated with it. And I came to Chicago in the late 80s, 86, 87, to be Raya Donetskaya's secretary. So I worked as her secretary the last couple of years of her life. And from then on, I became an activist. I was a national organizer for News and Letters Committee, the original Marxist Humanist organization, for quite a number of years. In 2008, News and Letters was kind of falling apart and was going through a lot of problems. Most of the members of the organization decided to try to start from a new leaf and was not dissatisfied with where the group was going and wanted to kind of start some new sorts of initiatives. And so we formed a new group called the International Marxist Humanist Organization, which I've been involved in since 2008.
When that split up, were there 3 different Marxist humanist organizations at that point? The News and Letters, IMHO,
no.
and News and Letters fell apart and it became IMHO and MHI at that point?
There was no MHI. Kleiman's MHI group came later. Kleiman came out with us along with the rest of the group, and which formed the International Marxist Humanist Organization. But he quickly, after the split with News and Letters, developed differences. He wanted a very tight type of organizational structure, and wanted a very almost kind of a centralist kind of organizational structure, which he felt would protect the group from some of the problems that we experienced at NML. But the vast majority, almost everybody in the group didn't agree with that. And so he would often form the Marxist Humanist Initiative. And so comes after the formation of the IMHO.
Raya Donetskaya is really the theorist that is most significant for the Marxist humanist tradition.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. She was Trotsky's secretary for a while. And
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So how important is Trotsky for the Marxist humanist tendency in the United States?
Not much. She broke from Trotskyism already in 1950, which is even a decade before she actually called herself a Marxist humanist. So she was part of the Johnson Forrest tendency, along with Theodore James and Grace Lee Boggs, that were at first a dissident tendency within the Workers' Party, and then the Socialist Workers' Party in the late 40s. And by the late 40s, the JFT was becoming increasingly critical of Trotskyism, and it broke from Trotskyism in the Fourth International in the early 50s. And by the late 50s, not long after the Hungarian Revolution, Dunayevskaya began to develop the philosophy of Marxist humanism, which was building upon her earlier work, but there was no philosophy or conception as such of Marxist humanism until after the Hungarian Revolution. That was embodied in her first book, Marxism and Freedom. So we're not Trotskyists, we're not Leninists, we don't support the notion of a vanguard party, we don't support really much of anything in Lenin's organizational theory. And of course, as you know, Trotskyists kind of fetishize that dimension of Lenin as if that was the answer to everything. And we're also very critical of Trotsky as well, because fundamentally we don't think that his alternative to Stalinism was deep enough to pose a true alternative. So Trotsky is important to us insofar as he made a valiant attempt to try to resist Stalinism. He's an important historical figure, and one can learn much from some of his work. But he's a tragic figure because I think his opposition to Stalinism was partial and ended up in a cul-de-sac.
So what is the Johnson-Forrest tendency?
Well, the Johnson-Forrest tendency was a rather remarkable coming together of different thinkers in the American radical movement over the question, initially at least, over the question of the nature of the Soviet Union in the early 40s, when following the Hitler-Stalin Pact, there was, of course, a great amount of debate in the international left about how to characterize the Soviet Union now that it had developed or retrogressed to the point of actually allying itself with Hitler and being the co-initiator of World War II. So there was many, many different thinkers, many different parts of the Western world and the non-Western world who were very disturbed by what they saw in the Soviet Union and were trying to give an account of what had happened there. So originally the Johnson-Forrest tendency was formed within the Workers' Party USA as a collective tendency to develop an analysis of the nature of the Soviet Union through the eyes of Marxist capital. That is, taking the categories of Marxist capital and examining the Soviet economy, what does one determine the Soviet Union to be as a social system? And they concluded, C.L.I. James and Grace Lee and Dunayevskaya did most of the economic work, but all three of them were doing this kind of project, was that it was state capitalist. So they conducted the first rigorous analysis of the Soviet Union or Soviet-type societies as state capitalist societies. So that was one of the things that united the Johnson-Forrest tendency. But there was a second dimension which was just as important, although it's less known, and that is they weren't simply critiquing the nature of the Soviet Union. They also were responding to new subjective forces in liberation movements in the period, and they developed a conception of struggles of national minorities, especially in the U.S., the black dimension, as at the vanguard of freedom struggles in the U.S. and elsewhere. So they criticized a class-only or a class-primary approach, and they began to do very innovative work on race theory and feminist theory all the way back in the 40s, at a time when in the American left this was virtually unheard of. Because the predominant view at that time, including in the Trotskyist movement, was there is no race question outside the class question. And that is something that James and Dunayevskaya directly criticized. Very major aspect of their work, which is getting some more attention now. If you want to think about Hegelian Marxism in general, and what were the roots of Hegelian Marxism in America? Because usually you think of Hegelian Marxism, you think of the Frankfurt School, you think of European development. You don't usually think of the United States. It's a very pragmatic, anti-philosophical land, including especially in terms of the left. But the Johnson-Forrest tendency was really the first group of radicals in American history to do serious work on Hegel, and especially Hegel's connection to Marx. And this was very important, and path-breaking studies were being done in the 40s and 50s. Dunayevskaya continued this. James and Lee broke away from that and stopped doing that after the 50s. But she continued that right to the end of her life. So one could say that the origins of American Hegelian Marxism is a John Sephora's tendency.
I'm wanting to talk to you about that second part of the tendency. That's the one that I think I probably get the most hung up on, which is I'm not sure I quite understand what it means to understand race apart from class. It seems like you would have to view race because it's a superstructural kind of appearance. You'd have to understand it in relationship to the class system. Like, I don't think of class as primarily about being working class or like being a type of person, but about this division in society that sets up a kind of production. And so I would think that you would want to approach race within that context of a class society or within capitalism.
Well, of course, that's what they did, and that's what Marxist humanism very much affirms. So we don't consider race outside the question of class. But also, we don't think of race as completely reducible to the question of class, because people of color experience class relations and class domination in different ways, and people are not people of color. The specific thing that Donetskaya argued, which I think is a very strong argument, is that class relations actually in the United States have always been mediated and shaped by racial determinations. This is not true everywhere in the world, by the way, but it's certainly true in the United States, where it's very difficult to even map the trajectory of class formation without taking into consideration the racial determinations. So when you have a radical politics, which is the traditional class reductionist type of politics, which views race as a superstructural or secondary or epiphenomenal phenomenon, that's unable to deal with that material reality of how actually class formation exists. So it's not emphasizing class for the sake of I'm not emphasizing race for the sake of denigrating class or separating it from class. But on the contrary, I'd argue that an adequate approach to the class question in the United States requires grasping that there are moments when the struggle against race and racism and for national liberation has an independent validity of its own that's not reducible to the class struggle, and that indeed those racial struggles or struggles over racial issues can become the catalyst for future or ongoing class struggles, even if they are not directly at the point of production, or even if they are not solely consisting of the working class.
So when you say that race has always been sort of determinative of how the working class was formed in the United States, are you thinking back to maybe the push west and land grabs and how land was divvied up along racial lines in the settler days?
And of course, well, that's part of it. Of course, it's also slavery and the remnants of slavery after the abolition of slavery with sharecropping and the Boston-Black relationship and the Black codes and what that did to the whole structure of American capitalism. And how this is wound into the fabric of American civilization from its very foundation. Certainly the expropriation and the extermination of the Native Americans plays a big role in this. The African slave trade plays a big role in this. But this is not a historical issue, right? This is also contemporary. I mean, Marx, had that phrase, the so-called primitive accumulation, which people misunderstand very often. But what that means is that primitive accumulation is not or specifically assigned necessarily to pre-capitalist, the emergence of capitalism from out of pre-capitalism gets reproduced within capitalist relations of production as well. And you can say that as a kind of a parallel, the kind of direct naked exploitation engendered by the type of European racism that shaped America is also something that continuously recurs and resurfaces and shapes and reshapes class relations, including right now. Especially right now, as a matter of fact.
So during the time of slavery, there was a European working class, right? At the same time. But it was also formulated maybe along racial lines in relationship to whiteness. Like if you were Italian, you weren't white and you're more likely to be working class, or if you're Irish. Is that right? Or what, how did race determine that the non-slave working class at that time? Well,
I mean, if you take a look at, for instance, the early communist movement in the United States, when the Socialist Party was breaking up under the impact of World War I and the Russian Revolution and the formation of the groups that became eventually the U.S. Communist Party. I mean, the real brunt of the socialist communist movement in the U.S. at the time, certainly the revolutionary wing of that movement, were the immigrants from Russia, from Italy, from various countries in Europe. And it was these foreign language federations, of course, that were very, very active. Each one, the Finns had their own communist organization, Poles had their own communist organization, Italians had their own, the Jews, of course, had more than one, several. But the problem is that they didn't have an understanding of the race question in America, because this is something they did not experience themselves in Europe. And they found themselves incredibly isolated from the mass of the American working class, and especially the black working class. So one of the big debates that was going on in the formation of the early communist movement was how to Americanize communism, right? How to bring these immigrant groups to recognize and acknowledge this formation of racial stratification, what it represents. And to them, of course, to many of these immigrants, and understandably because they weren't brought up in the U.S. context, to them it was like, what's the difference between a black worker and a white worker? They're both exploited by capital. There's no reason for us to make any special appeal to one vis-a-vis the other, right? Kind of an abstract revolutionism. But that's exactly what kept them isolated from those currents. At the same time that the Garvey movement has emerged, and you have, several million people in the University Negro Improvement Association. It's not a left-wing organization. It's certainly not a Marxist or a communist organization, but it stirred up a lot of agitation in the black community, and it helped radicalize large sections of the black community. But these moved in a trajectory that was very different than the early communist movement in the U.S. And it was only later, beginning in the late 20s, that the U.S. communists began to get their act together and realize that, hey, they've got to recognize that, there's something they have missed about the specific contours of U.S. historical development, and talking about history in the making. And that was a debate that was also something that then took place in the Trotskyist movement, who was frankly further behind the communists on this in the 30s. They had virtually no African-American members until C.L.R. James came along. And they didn't have a great deal of sensitivity to the question of the race problem in America.
So what was the answer what was the answer to that question? What is the difference between a black worker and a white worker, since they're both exploited by the capitalist class in the same system of production?
Well, of course, they're both exploited, and the exploitation, of course, covers all sorts of people. But the point is that a black worker is not simply exploited for being a worker. They're exploited on the basis of being black. And a white, therefore, can very often identify with the ruling elite, thinking that they're better off than the black, who is denigrated and exploited far more than they. If not an economic advantage that they might gain from that, they certainly gain a psychological advantage. And that creates all kinds of divisions and ruptures within the labor movement. And there's a long history of that kind of tension.
So I'm not trying to be dumb here. I mean, I guess I am trying to be dumb in a way. I mean, I do understand the difference, certainly on the level of like appearance, and also just on the level of, say, lived social reality. But I'm trying to think about what the difference would be for a black worker as opposed to a white worker as a worker, and whether or not it has. I mean, you say that the black workers are exploited as black people, and are you saying what do you mean to say that their wages were suppressed based on their race?
Well, of course, there has been the whole differentiation between wages based on race. Of course, that's certainly
right. So that's like step one. Okay, go ahead.
Why were black caucuses formed in the unions? Right, going back to the formation of the CIO. I mean, there was a huge migration of blacks into the industrial heartland in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Black labor was instrumental in the formation of the UMW, the mine workers. People forget about a third of the mine workers in America used to be African American. And not to mention, of course, everybody knows about the UAW and steel workers and other industries. But they found at the same time, in their own unions, in their own efforts to improve their lot, they experienced racial discrimination from fellow workers or union bureaucrats. And black workers very often felt the need to organize their own caucuses in order to address their specific needs that were not being addressed by the general, if you want to call it this, class struggle. And this gave rise to some very interesting developments and some very contentious ones.
Well, see, I think this might be where I'm having some difficulty or some conceptual problems, is because I tend to think, and really this may be a big problem in my own thinking. I tend to think that when you want to understand the working class and as a class, you don't look to political formations. You look to what people do, like say on the shop floor, and how they're situated within the economy, and whatever they choose to do outside of that realm, say in the realm of politics, doesn't tell you much about their actual class position. So, and then if you want to ask the question like, why aren't certain workers organizing more politically? You can look at all sorts of factors, but those are political questions. They don't help you understand what the position of that person is within the economic realm. Like, I don't see a direct connection, say, between like, the degree to which you're exploited and the degree to which you might organize. So I think I might have the wrong conception, or a too like flat-footed or one-sided conception of what it is to be a working class person.
Well, what if you're not a working class person? What if you're petty bourgeois and you're suffering racial discrimination and you mobilize against that discrimination? Does that make you outside the class struggle? Does that make you your struggle relatively insignificant compared to the class struggle?
Well, insignificant, no, not necessarily, but it does. I do wonder. You'd have to ask the question like, how were you organizing against your oppression? What was your project? If your project was, say, for instance, and this is like, I'm very much speaking the contemporary moment, to try to, for instance, pass hate speech laws, and go to the government to try to get stricter enforcement of against hate speech. That may not be in any way helpful for a socialist revolution.
Well, a lot of things are not helpful for socialist revolution. Fighting for higher wages are not helpful for socialist revolution either, necessarily. That doesn't mean that it's not part of the class struggle.
Okay. Well, some things might be counterproductive, though. Like, I think, say, it's arguable whether or not empowering the state to control people's speech is going to help the class. If you think the class struggle is overcoming means overcoming your class position, then it's arguable whether or not, say, hate speech laws, as an example. I'm not saying that I'm right here, but this is what comes to mind, would be part of a class struggle.
Well, I think that's a separate issue. I mean,
right.
Hate speech laws are not part of the class struggle. That's a separate juridical question,
right?
Concerning how to deal with issues of the First Amendment.
Right. So my point there was not to focus on the example. I was just trying to find an example which might not contribute to the class struggle, and that was one that came to mind.
A lot of things don't contribute to the class struggle.
Right.
That goes without saying. I mean, if blacks say we will go back to the land and we would have like just have black only, go back to the land and buy our own farms, and like what the Nation of Islam tried to do in the 60s, and there's still some of them are trying to do it today, to build up black economic empowerment through their own self-activity. Of course, that's a diversion that has nothing to do with the class struggle. But that's not, that's rather, that goes without saying, just a lot of things are not going to do. Not every struggle is progressive, and not every struggle is linked to or not linked to the class struggle. You have to look at them on their specific terms. There's no generalization that's going to give you the answer to that.
Right. So, but my question is, and how do we determine what aspects of the struggle against racism? And I think that it's absolutely true that a project for black capitalism is a kind of struggle against racism. It's not an anti-racist struggle. So what parts?
Just like there are struggles against class domination that operate within the confines of the capitalist system. It's called social democracy. You know?
Right, exactly.
Or unionism, trade unionism. I'm for trade unions. I'm a member of I'm on the executive board of my local union, but I'm fully aware that what my union does is completely within the confines of existing capitalist relations and does not challenge them.
Right. Okay.
That doesn't mean that I involve myself in that struggle, because that's an important struggle to have.
Right.
I mean, just if I can throw out my own example. I mean, if you looked at the auto industry, for instance, a quick example. I mean, where did you find most blacks working in the auto shops, right? Go to the body shop. That's where most African Americans were working. How did it happen that most African Americans just happened to be working in the body shop? I'm talking about back in the day when they didn't have all this automation and everything.
Right.
Well, it's because it was the hardest and dirtiest job, and and they had the least level of education, African Americans. So that's where they were sidetracked to. That's where they were kind of directed towards.
Right.
And a worker who lined up who was a white worker and said, hey, I want to work in the body shop, they would say, oh, you want to work with the Negroes? I mean, now there was a segment of people inside the union, inside the class struggle, who felt disproportionately discriminated because of where they were tracked into in terms of the labor process. And they were tracked there quite deliberately.
They had worse working conditions because of their race, and they often had worse or lower wages because of their.
And therefore, when they challenged it, they simply didn't challenge it purely on a wage level, or they didn't challenge it purely on a economic level. They also challenged it in terms of developing pride in who they were as blacks, organizing black caucuses to try to get to know each other and develop social solidarity among members of their own kind, right?
Yeah, but I would say that struggling for just basic respect is universal for the working class. I mean, it's obviously for black workers it's going to be even more significant, but it's even at I remember there was a strike at Powell's Books, and part of it was that the bosses were trying to control how and who talked about which sections of the bookstore, and that basically they're trying to break up the expertise that had developed in the workers. Like some workers had been in, say, the science fiction section for a decade, and they just wanted to rotate them out and not have them stay in that area, which they felt like was a waste of their talents and didn't recognize their abilities and what they were good at. So they felt it was disrespectful to them, and they were struggling against this change. It had nothing to do with wages. It didn't have to do with hours. It didn't have to do with any of those kind of material things. It had to do with respecting them as workers. And that happens, I think, a lot. So I think that's sort of that struggle for respect can be quite revolutionary.
That's right. And it takes a variety of different forms. And it doesn't always take a class it's not always identifiable as a specific class struggle. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's outside the class. Sometimes it's broader than a class struggle. Sometimes it's a popular struggle. And sometimes it's community struggle. Like when police kill a young black kid on the South Side and people come out to protest it, and they want to know how come this doesn't happen on the North Side, but it's happening on the South Side, right? Simply saying, well, you're workers and all workers are exploited, that's not going to answer that question, right? So that's why they're not going to be amenable to that type of language that would suggest that there is no fundamental difference between them and any other person who simply is a worker. This intuitive understanding that they're just not simply a worker, that they bring an additive of color to their experience that has to be addressed independently and on its own terms.
So earlier I said that I tended to think that understanding whether or not someone was a worker could be separated out from understanding or seeing what they did politically. And it seems like in our conversation that maybe wasn't a mistake. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, if you simply want a generic definition of a worker, it's somebody who simply doesn't own the means of production, has no ownership stake in the means of production, and sells themselves for a wage.
Right.
And that's I think, the most generic definition of a worker. In that sense, we have about 5 billion workers in the world. Certainly 3 billion by the lowest count, but of course you have to count in unwaged workers like domestic workers and women raising children who are not waged, but nevertheless they don't own the means of production, so they're simply not waged for their labor. So that would increase the number probably close to 4.5 or 5 billion. But the question of but that doesn't get us very far, right? That's just a very generic definition of what class means in terms of wage labor. In terms of understanding the class, yes, you can't separate it from the forms of political struggle that the class assumes. Marx famously, had trouble finishing Volume 3 of Capital. The last chapter is supposed to be, was intended and to be on classes, right? And it's an unfinished chapter. Volumes have been written about this. Why Marx, who spent his entire life talking about class struggle, couldn't figure out how to define or adequately complete his explanation of class struggle in Volume 3 of Capital. And I think that one of the best answers to that question is that he didn't have to do it. He didn't have to define it. It's defined through the content of the entire work. The entire content of Capital is imminently connected to the various forms of class struggle, including political forms of class struggle for a shorter working day, right? A shorter struggle for the 8-hour day, et cetera, et cetera. Chapter 10 delineates this in quite detail in Volume 1. It's the actual forms of the class struggle themselves that tell us what the class is, in particular historical periods. We can abstract from that and give a more generic description, but the generic description is rather empty, right? It's simply anyone who simply sells themselves for a wage, but is not a holder or possessor of the means of production.
Yeah, I just find that description to be much more full than most descriptions I get of the working class, because it can be mapped out. Like, you can start from a initial premise. You can, if you grasp the first chapter of Capital about the need for a third thing to make the exchange of commodities work as an exchange of equal things. That kind of. If you go down this line of argumentation, it fills out as you go along, and what it is to be a worker and what it is to sell your labor power. There's a whole system that you can start to understand. But when you start talking about what it is to be like a revolutionary subject or a worker as a political force rather than as a kind of a cog in a system of production, I don't feel like we have nothing like the systemic description. So I feel like that side, that definition of worker is a little more empty, because it doesn't, we have some emotions we can associate it with it, and we have some demands that we know are naturally coming out of this being a cog, like the demand for respect, the demand for basic human conditions of work. But we don't have, any way to map out how those arise in a human subject. It almost seems like that there's a mystery at the heart of that's opaque. Like, what makes someone act? How do they become political? What makes them break with their position within the system and go beyond it? And also just what makes them want to reform the system they're in? At what point do you say these conditions aren't livable, aren't human? How many people have to die before you realize that the situation is unacceptable? None of these things are easy to answer.
No, I agree. Yeah, that's why one has to be very specific and concrete in one's analysis. That's right.
Right.
So there's no transhistorical explanation for this.
Right. And that's why history starts to be, you have to know as much as possible about the conditions in a particular area to really understand what brought people to act. So this brings me to Moich Postone in a roundabout way, because Postone, I think, is a great theorist in the abstract, right? He's got a pretty good grasp of Marx's categories and the system and what the implications are. And I think what he does in relationship to critical theory is interesting too, his critique of history as a concept. But his politics, or his belief in the working class as a revolutionary subject it's practically non-existent. And where do you think Postone ends up not, aligned with humanism? How is it that he has pretty much the same understanding of the theory but doesn't end up having the same politics?
No, he doesn't have the same understanding of the theory. His theory completely corresponds to his politics. His whole project to, as he puts it, to reinterpret Marx's value theory, such as to argue that it is completely abstracted from class struggle. And that is why his political political position corresponds completely, I think, and quite logically consistent with his theoretical position. Pistone's is a very serious book. I think it was probably the first English language review of Pistone's book when it first came out in the mid-90s, and I published 3 different discussions of Fanon after that in 3 different places. So plus in my book on Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism, I take him up in the first chapter. So he's a serious person that needs to be engaged, and I find his book one of the most refreshing and important books on Marxist theory in the last 20 years. However, that said, I think it's a flawed analysis of capital because he reads capital in order to draw out the conclusion he wished to come to from the reading, and that is he's somebody who is reading it as somebody influenced from the New Left, which had this scared of the revolutionary capacity of the working class, and he was trying to salvage Marx from that despair of that loss of faith in the proletariat, and trying to argue that, on the contrary, not only does Marx's value theoretic categories not suffer from the loss of the proletariat as the revolutionary subject, but it actually gains from it. And that's the core of his analysis. Now, he turns to value theory, and he turns to important aspects of value theory in doing so, like focusing, as I do, on the dual character of labor as a pivot of Marx's critique of capital. But his reading of the dual character of labor is very peculiar and leads him to the conclusion that class struggle is extraneous to Marx's value theoretic categories. And that's a very non-humanistic reading of Marx's Capital. My reading goes in the very opposite direction by arguing that it's actually the value theoretic categories of themselves embedded in class dynamics and class relations. Even the most abstract level of Marx's work, even on volume 2 of Capital, where you would think it would show itself the least. So I think that Stone is somebody who was reading Marx from a certain angle, just like Neue Deutsche, the New German Critique in Germany, Backhaus and Reichelt and other people. It's not original in this sense. They were also responding to the same phenomena. The apparent to them disappearance of the working class as a revolutionary subject. What does Marxism mean in light of it? And they're interpreting or reinterpreting Marx's value theory to explain what they take as a given.
Okay, so let me just think if I can work out the right question to ask here, because I think there's a piece there where I get a little confused, and it's the move from it's saying that these categories are embedded in the working class. Obviously, these categories define the activities of the working class, right? I mean, if you go to work and you sell your labor power, you go to work and you get a wage and you get exploited and you produce a commodity, all those categories are determining how you act. I mean, that's defining what you're doing as a working class person. What do you mean when you say that these categories are embedded in the working class?
Well, that may not have been the best choice of words, but the basic position that Pistone has is he does not think that there's a difference between the laborer and the value form of their labor power. He thinks that the subjectivity of the laborer is completely absorbed in the value form.
Oh.
So therefore,
okay, keep going.
For Pistone, and he is correct on this, Marx is not, when he talks about labor in capitalist society, he's not talking about a transhistorical notion of labor in general. He's talking about a very specific, peculiar social form of labor that is unique to capitalism, which is abstract or alienated labor, concrete labor that is governed by socially necessary labor time and takes the form of an abstraction, abstract labor, and that abstract labor is a substance of value. So when somebody is laboring, right, it's not the actual labor time or activity that they're engaged in which actually generates the value. What generates the value is a transformation of the laboring activity into this abstract form of domination by your concrete laboring activity being subjected to socially necessary labor time. Now, he from this draws the conclusion that there's no, therefore, fundamental difference between the laborer and the value form of the exercise of labor power. And therefore, there's no internal resistance to this process of suction of augmenting ever more abstract labor at the expense of concrete labor. which is why he says the working class becomes increasingly homogenized or dominated by the value form and cannot pose an effective opposition or resistance to it. The more the abstraction gets generated, the more powerful the subsumption of concrete labor by abstract labor goes on, is the less that there's any visible possibility of proletarian subjectivity to manifest itself against the system because it's completely absorbed by the system. The subject is absorbed into the object.
Okay.
That's his reading of Capital.
Let me see if I can. I think I have a little, like a glimpse of an idea, or like I think I'm following you a little bit here. And to me, it seems. Tell me if I'm wrong about this. I may be completely wrong, but it seems to me to be connected to the fact that, say, robots can't create value because it's not a matter of the real. It's not a matter of the physical production that matters, that creates the value. It's the social fact of the domination of the labor time that creates the value. It's, in other words, that relationship is fundamentally political and is about dominating or controlling or systemizing human activity. And without human activity, specifically social human activity, you wouldn't have any value at the end of the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And Stone knows that. And I know, of course, that's true. I don't think there's no contestation between myself and Stone or vice versa on that issue.
Right.
Any serious Marxist theorist knows that, the value is not created by dead labor. It's created by living labor. But Stone is arguing that general scientific knowledge, general intellect, Marx refers to in the passage in the Grundrisse, because you have to understand, Stone's reading of Capital is really highly informed by the Grundrisse, right? Especially the last section of the Grundrisse dealing with the automaton and the machinery and modern machinery, which does not appear in Capital. But Stone is kind of doing a reading of Capital from the vantage point of the Grundrisse rather than vice versa. So what he's arguing is that when you get to highly developed high-tech capitalism, of course, there's a much smaller, ever smaller proportion of living labor that's responsible for value production. Organic composition of capital grows exponentially relative to living labor, but the embodiment of past labor in that dead product becomes so huge that capital now can live, as it were, reproduce itself on its own basis. Therefore, the worker becomes not unimportant for capital. He understands that if capitalism completely eliminates living labor, it's going to have a crisis of value production. But the working class itself no longer is in the position to actually, so to speak, stop the system from functioning as it is, given that accumulated scientific knowledge, that accumulated abstract intellect that's embodied in the machine. So abstract universal labor time, in other words, becomes so predominant that it's the fuel that, as it were, allows the system to reproduce itself in the way that it's doing. Now, of course, he's aware that this is a very unstable process. And in his book, he tries to make it clear, distinguishing himself from people like Pollock and Habermas and other people in the Frankfurt School that viewed this, or Marcuse, who viewed this as kind of a one-dimensional process. He argues that it's fraught with contradictions and it's fraught with instability. And he argued that, well, his next book, that was going to be his follow-through work, The Time, Labor, and Social Domination, was going to be to explain how you can get out of capitalism based upon this situation. That is, if living labor is no longer the revolutionary subject, and as he proclaims, dead labor is now the emancipatory subject, how do you get from dead labor's emancipatory subject to an emancipatory politics? Now, I'll be frank with you. When I my first review of the book back in '94 or something like that, I was very tempted to write, but I decided not to because I thought it would be extremely unfair. There'd be no empirical evidence for it, so you don't put something like that in the review unless you can predict the future. None of us can. But I I said I would bet that he would never get he'll never get to write the subsequent volume. And he never did. Because I just don't think it's possible to work something like that out. I think that leads to a dead end. How can if dead labor is the emancipatory alternative, then you're back to the conception that capital itself will bring forth post-capitalist society through some sort of internal fracturing, economic crisis. Who knows? He didn't explain exactly how. But only human beings in the final analysis can overthrow capitalism. And if you evacuate the subject from the logic of capital and you say these are running on two completely different tracks, I don't see how you can come up with a politics that actually addresses the crisis of capital. And this is part of my problem with a lot of the capital logic folks, not only Pistone, but you also get in some of the other theoreticians, C.J. Arthur. You can talk about Backhaus. You can talk about others. There's really no strategic vision of how to respond to the present crisis of capitalism with its increased forms of abstract domination. There's no strategic perspective.
Because there's no revolutionary subject.
Right. Pistone went so far as to say, well, I challenged him once directly on this at a panel. He said, I didn't say there's not a revolutionary subject. He said there is a subject, but the subject is capital.
Right. Right. But so what does he mean when he talks about a subject? I mean, maybe this is a key. I have two questions. The one is sort of technical, and I'm going to ask it first. So when he's talking about how capital has accumulated enough scientific knowledge and basically automation and productive forces so that it requires very little in terms of living labor to continue, which that seems like indisputable to me. It's possible to have fewer and fewer workers actually producing commodities, right? And then more and more people doing service sector jobs or other kinds of waged work, or just being unemployed and living off of, who knows what, instead. And so it doesn't seem, but the thing about that is it also seems that this situation makes, as you said, and which I think is also unavoidable, makes capitalism in the society very unstable. That, we're kind of always on the verge of the next crisis, economic crisis. So is the reason why the proletariat class is no longer the revolutionary force because it isn't large enough? There aren't enough people who are actually proletariat, meaning they're actually the ones responsible for creating the value in society?
Well, there's certainly a lot of people who make that argument.
Is that what his argument is? Is that Pistone's argument?
No, it goes much further back. Pistone wants to argue that was never part of Marx's project. Mm-hmm. That at the time Marx wrote Capital, that the whole point to writing Capital, Pistone argues, is Marx has already broken from the notion that he might have had in his earlier writings, which Pistone thinks are not worth. Doesn't think much before the Grinnerism is much worth reading in Marx. Doesn't think the 1844 manuscripts, for instance, are that significant, because he finds that to be a more romanticized transhistorical conception in Marx. He says Marx's Capital itself abstracts from the notion, or rejects the notion, that there is a resolution to the class struggle, to the crisis of capitalism. He argues that what Capital actually shows is that, yes, there is, of course, class struggle, but class struggle, workers try to increase their the amount of value that they obtain that is expropriated as surplus value by the capitalists. They're always in a struggle to gain a better redistribution of value. And when the capitalists are forced to accede to the workers' demands, they automate and lay off workers in order to increase the productivity of labor, so that their profit margins will not be compromised. So he's arguing that basically he's not saying that Marx does not say class struggle exists, but he says the basic structure and logic and content of Capital tells us that the class struggle does not point to a transcendence of capitalism. It can only point towards a further development of capitalism. The class struggle accelerates capitalist accumulation. It does not challenge it. That's the fundamental message of this entire book. And that's, if you can call anything original in Pistone, it's that claim that it is in Marx himself that this is what Marx believes and what Marx demonstrates in his good theoretical work.
Well, it could be in Marx. It could be in Marx's work, even if Marx didn't believe it. Like, he could have argued in such a way that would lead one consistently to that conclusion, even if Marx didn't quite see it, right? I mean, so we don't know what he believed. But okay.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem is that there's Anselm Yaffe has been honest about this, and why I'll mention it is because he's a bit more open about this than Pistone. But I think Pistone agreed with that after a few years. You can do it by saying there's an esoteric Marx and esoteric Marx, right? So there's an exoteric Marx, which is the Marx of the Communist Manifesto and the Marx of the 18th Brumaire and the Marx of his revolutionary journalism, the Marx that goes to work, the Marx of the First International, who's organizing workers. But that, it doesn't, according to the claim, not a claim I accept, that exoteric Marx has nothing to do with the content of Capital, which has an esoteric analysis which points in a completely different direction. And they would say, whether Marx knew this or not, or was aware of this or conscious of this dualism within him, is not important for them or for us. The only thing that's important is, because it's not his exoteric work that lives on in the 21st century, it's his esoteric critique in Capital that lives on. So it's the only thing that we need to pay attention to, because the other stuff is, so to speak, biographical. It's like, Pistone is very dismissive, or was very dismissive, for instance, of a lot of the work that many of us have been doing to show Marx's writings on the non-Western world in the last 10, 15 years of his life. And he argues that, well, this is not central to his project. This is something he was doing on the side. He was reading anthropology and ethnology, making some notes. Yes, he was interested in China and Indonesia and Russia, but what did that have to do with what the subject matter of Capital is? Well, I think it had everything to do with the subject matter of Capital. But
now, what did that work have to do? What would your answer be other than just everything? Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, as you're well aware, Doug, is that the model for Volume 1 of Capital, not the model, but I mean, in the sense of the model in terms of his empirical investigation was England, yes? And it was a study within the British Museum, the Blue Books, and all this massive empirical material about the development of capitalism in England, which basically informed much of the discussion of the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, Volume 1 of Capital. But of course, people started reading Capital once it was published, especially in places that were then the developing world, like Russia. And the question immediately came to mind, is this a description of what happened in Western Europe, or is this a prognosis of what is bound to happen to the rest of us? Yeah? Are we bound to follow this historical tendency of capital accumulation, from feudalism to capitalism, primitive accumulation, etc.? Are we bound to follow this process ourselves in areas where we're first beginning to see some elements of capitalism entering in? Now, Marx therefore clarifies in 1872 in the second German edition in response to some of these questions that were coming in, and he makes it very clear in 1872 German edition, second edition, that Volume 1 of Capital, this discussion of the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, is expressly limited to a description of what happened in Western Europe based on the English model. It does not tell us anything one way or the other about developments in other areas. Okay? So it was not a universal theory that he was developing. It's not a universal theory of historical development. It's not a deterministic, they always say Marx is the determinist, everything has to follow this path. He was saying this is the deterministic path that has followed up to now in Europe, in Western and Central Europe. And it's an open question what would or could happen outside that context. And that's why he then turns and spends a lot of time, the rest of it, learns Russian when he's, in his 50s, and tries to absorb. Now he's absorbing an enormous amount of empirical material about two countries in the world, which don't figure in the Volume 1 of Capital hardly at all. And that is Russia and the United States, right? Plus he's got a lot of other stuff going on that he's studying in the last decade of his life from other places in Asia and Latin America and Africa. The question is why he's doing this. Well, there's another question that we always have to ask. How is it that Marx finished most of Volume 3 of Capital, at least, and a good chunk of Volume 2 of Capital, before he even published Volume 1 in 1867, had 16 years after the publication of Volume 1 to finish Volumes 2 and 3, the bulk of which, at least of Volume 3, was already done, and yet never published them, never got them done? Now, there's a lot of theories about this, claims about this. I mean, the most crude that he simply was running out of gas the last 10 years of his life, and he was slowly dying. His health was bad, and he couldn't do serious theoretical work for the last decade of his life. There's more sophisticated explanations, but the one I favor, frankly, is that I think Marx had some real problems figuring out how to deal with the circulation of capital and the reproduction of capital on a total level, which is a subject matter of volumes 2 and 3, without taking into account the non-Western world. And it was left undone because his research on this matter was left undone. I mean, it was a big area.
So do you think capitalism in China, as it was developing, didn't require workers to sell their labor power and be exploited, so that it wasn't production for exchange in the way that Marx describes in Capital Volume 1?
Well, there wasn't capitalism in China in Marx's lifetime at all.
Right. Okay.
China had gone through periods of industrialization, but a non-capitalistic industrialization, quasi-industrialization.
Right.
But capitalism doesn't come really to China. It starts to creep in the early 20th century in marginal areas. But
so he needed to understand how Europe and how capitalism was relating to non-capitalist economies. Would that be right? So what?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And then the question would be, maybe, can these countries where capitalism hasn't taken hold get to socialism without having to go through capitalism first?
Well, that was the question that was being debated among the Russian Marxists, among others. And Marx, his letters to Zer0 spends a lot of time on that question that she posed. Does Russia have to go through an extended period of capitalism before socialism? And he does not come to a definitive answer. The only answer you can say that it comes to, it's not the Marxist answer. That is the so-called Marxist answer that, of course, it does have to, which was the orthodox position of Plekhanov and then Lenin, and both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks completely uncritically accepted that there has to be this long period of maturation of capital before Russia would be ready for social revolution. He definitely doesn't take that position, but he doesn't take the populist position either and say, oh, well, you can get to socialism in the next 5 years on the basis of simply what you have now. It's a much more nuanced argument. It's an open question for Marx, but it's open precisely because what he has worked out in Volume 1 of Capital doesn't answer the question.
Do you think it's still a living problem? Because, today it seems like global capitalism has taken hold. There is nowhere that isn't capitalist today, hardly.
Well, in general, but there's a lot of lumps. There's a very lumpy capitalism. It's not a smooth, polished surface, right? Mm-hmm. And I spent some time in the Bolivian highlands several years ago, part of the Fulbright Hays Scholarship grant. We were studying indigenous peoples in the Aymara region, Aymara indigenous peoples in northern Bolivia and southern Peru. And there you have, Bolivia and Peru, of course, capitalist society. There's no question. But there is strong remnants still to this day of pre-capitalist social formations that exist among the Aymara, especially the Ayul, this extended kinship structure and communal relationships of owning the land, and where they even get displaced from the land, they maintain those communal relationships when they move to the cities, and therefore they retain this kind of interesting connection to the countryside. And these are non-capitalistic dimensions that exist within the spaces or the folds of capitalism. Marx was much less wary than his followers to simply make abstract generalizations about the inevitability of these pre-capitalist formations to be completely subsumed by capital. Because there's a lot of evidence of places where they haven't been completely subsumed by capital. They've been partially subsumed, or they've been largely subsumed, or they've been minimally subsumed. But there's a lot of differentiation depending on where you're looking and what you're looking at. So this is where a lot of Marxists get into trouble with theoretical generalization that's not based on real observation of what's going on the ground.
Yeah, and I can see why Postone, who was saying that capital is a subject of history, wouldn't be that interested in studies of areas where capitalism hasn't taken hold, because it seems to be almost that he's saying that at a certain point, maybe, when enough technological development has occurred and the mode of production is so advanced within capitalism that it will be possible to just develop a new logic, maybe from the top down,
I think that's accurate.
To create a different kind of society. And so he's looking for capitalism to develop its way out of capitalism into socialism, despite the fact that when I interviewed him, I think he was pretty hesitant to say that directly. I mean, when I talked to him about like the Silicon Valley, utopian thinkers, he was incredibly skeptical of their projects. But I think that if you think capital is a subject of history right now, and that you think it could lead to socialism, then you have to kind of halfway anyway embrace the California techno Silicon Valley types. I mean, because they're going to be the ones
on some level or another. But you see, and this is why, in some respects, Fastone's position is very curious, because it's for all of his criticism of traditional Marxism, a category I find very slippery, by the way, because he had a tremendous blind spot towards traditions within Marxism that are not characterized by what he calls traditional Marxism, that do not prioritize private property. Marxist humanism does not prioritize private property over the abolition of the dual character of labor. And there's other tendencies as well. There's a council communist, there was Maddock, and we can mention a lot of other people. They completely disappear from his radar screen. And he never put them back on the radar screen. There was a real blind spot. It was almost in a fetishistic attachment to this kind of blind spot in his part, because that contradicts really the core of his theoretical thesis. But that aside, with all of this criticism of traditional Marxism, there is something very traditional that's kind of at least implied in Fastone's position, but I think Fastone was smart enough not to want to accept it or advocate it, and that is the old Second International notion that the development of the forces of production will bring the new society. I mean, what was Lukács critiquing in, History and Class Consciousness? The passivity, the determinism, the confidence in technology of the Second International that would lead the path to the new society, as it were, sui generis. But if you're saying capital is the subject, then we sit back and watch and see how this capital subject molts itself into something else. What role does human agency have to play in this transformation is left very, very unclear.
If you hold with this sort of what you're describing, the humanist tradition, that the workers' creative capacity is what might lead to socialism, I hear you saying that, then you still would think that places like China have to go through capitalist development, because they wouldn't have a working class without having done that.
Right. The point is that no country could make a socialist revolution without any connection to the proletariat. That would be impossible. But I mean, again, Marx's writings on Russia here are instructive. He's writing at a time when the working class proletariat was, minimal size in Russia, but it had a very large peasantry, and he recognizes, to his credit, that it's not like the West European peasantry. It's far more has much more revolutionary potential. Very variegated, but has a great deal of revolutionary potential. And he says, in the last final actual letter he sends to Zer0 that it's possible that Russia could make a revolution that would bypass the capitalist stage on the basis of these peasant communes and the basis of these peasant revolts, providing that they link up with the proletarian revolution in the West. So this really kind of gets also to my work on Fanon. The book on Frantz Fanon came out a few years ago. And here, this is what exactly Fanon was facing, right? At the moment that he writes The Wretched of the Earth, and the African revolutions have now succeeded in getting political independence from imperialism, what does he then say? He says, well, what now? I mean, we don't have much of a working class, and 1%, 2%, 3% of the population of a proletariat. These independence movements have been fueled by the peasantry, of course, led by the petty bourgeoisie, but fueled by the peasantry as the actual participants and fighters. How do we avoid getting sucked right back into the vortex of neocolonialism by a national bourgeois government, the national bourgeoisie that's going to obviously be soon taking over these countries? And that's when he raises the question of permanent revolution. Goes right back. He says we have to return to the Marxist formula, right? And think out what can be done to shorten or bypass this capitalistic stage. But the problem he's facing, right, is that he's already been very critical of the European left and not supporting the Algerian Revolution. He's come very close to writing off the West European working class. And yet at the same time, he's aware that left to their own devices, the African revolutions, even though they got to where they are thanks to this massive militant peasant participation, is not going to be able to break free from the chains of the bourgeois democratic model of development, even if it's, or not even bourgeois democratic, bourgeois undemocratic model of development. That's where he ends. He hasn't resolved the problem, right? But he's posing the question that's the same kind of question Marx was addressing in the end of his life, right? So yeah, China can't get, I mean, think about much of Africa today. I mean, still 2/3 of Africa are subsistence farmers. I mean, how would Congo get to socialism without, working class revolution that they are connected with somewhere? South Africa, the United States, who knows,
Well, let's ask that question. I mean, if they were connected to a proletariat revolution in the United States, then when that revolution went on and the Congo also joined in with the revolution, then they would basically share in the spoils of that the proletariats seized hold of. In other words, the kinds of technologies that capital developed, but also they would participate as in a new political order in which they would be free to develop their own creative capacities technologically and otherwise in their own society.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. That's right. So the problem is, how do you get to that?
Right.
And that's been the tragedy of the third world revolutions, that they never got to that, right? And this tragedy, it's not just because of the third world, it's because of the West, right?
Well, it seems to me that the problem is the workers have never really seized hold of the spoils of capitalism in order to create a new system of socialist production. That's never come to be.
That's right. That's never come to be, but it's also that, and this is what we're experiencing today in this country, is that a significant section of the working class, because of the way that significant section of the working class profits from imperialism and racism, don't even move in that direction. Okay? So that's comes right back to our earlier discussion on multiple forces of revolution, right?
But why didn't it happen in the Soviet Union? It wasn't because of the working class didn't move in that direction in the Soviet Union, right? There wasn't racism within the working class that stopped the proletariat from seizing. Because I guess in the Soviet Union and Russia there wasn't enough capital. Is that the idea that the capital hadn't developed enough, that it needed to come from Germany and Europe? That revolution needed to happen in order for socialism to really hold in Russia?
Well, there was no doubt. There's no doubt in my mind that even if they had done things, so to speak, the way one would want in Russia, which they didn't. And when I say the way they would want, there would be an actual seizure of power by the proletariat instead of a nominal seizure of power on behalf of the proletariat, which is basically what the Bolsheviks did. But had there been an actual seizure of power by the proletariat, would it have made a fundamental difference considering the objective constraints faced by Russia at that time? They still would have been invaded by 20 or some imperialist countries. They still would have been isolated. The question is, how would they have been able to, they still would have faced this massive peasantry. How were they going to find their way to socialism given those objective limitations? Once the West European revolutions do not succeed, there's really no possibility of Russia moving towards socialism. And here's where I'm critical of Trotsky, because there was basically two options, right? You stick with the NEP, which is a step back to capitalism, and you try to ameliorate the peasantry and minimize the conflict between the working class and the peasantry. You basically accept an extended period of kind of state capitalism, in not a Stalinistic type. I'm talking about state capitalism, an NEP version of state capitalism, and hold your breath and hope that, before everything gets completely corrupted and corroded by this capitalist dimension, that things will move for the better in the technologically developed countries. The only other possibility from that is what Stalin did, right? Which is to say, no, let's do it on our own and industrialize at a breakneck speed. And the only way to do that would be at the expense of the peasantry. Trotsky's economic program was essentially the same as Stalin's. This is not an accident that all of Trotsky's associates went over to Stalin in 1929. They abandoned him, and they all became part of the apparatus of the planning bureaus. because Trotsky wanted to get away from the NEP, and he wanted a rapid industrialization of Russia as well. He simply wanted it to be done in the way he wanted it to be done, with him in charge and not Stalin, and for it to have a more Democratic Party consultation and dimension of it, which Stalin was going to have. But the point is, there's not a fundamental distinction between his economic approach and Stalin's. And this is why Isaac Deutscher, the great Trotskyist, argued that Stalin was the inheritor of Trotsky's program, which made Trotsky very mad. But I think there was a lot of truth to that. So that's the choices they had. I mean, it's two really bad choices, right? I mean, now we know in retrospect, because they didn't know in 1929 how awful Stalinism was going to be. Don't forget, Stalin was not in 1929 what Stalin was in 1939. They didn't see 20 million perishing like this. They didn't see this horrible destruction. But some kind of had a sense that it can go in that direction. And then you do the first approach, which is basically an extended NEP. Well, this is what China has adopted, right? I mean, Deng Xiaoping was in Russia, that's what he studied in the 50s. And what did he study? He did his work on studying the NEP of up until the early 20s. And that taught him what China would one day have to do. Of course, Mao had a different idea. They fought over this for 25 years until finally he was able to take over after Mao's death. But of course, now it's a very different type of thing, because it's a full-blown embrace of capitalism. But what choice does a country have if there's not a proletarian revolution anywhere?
With the whole country at breaking point, Lenin had to rethink. The peasants were the key. To entice them to produce freely, the communists would have to restore the market and some measure of capitalism. Lenin decided the party and the country had no option. The new economic policy was born.
There was no way of running this country anymore without making a big deal with the peasants. And the deal was, let's give them the dose of capitalism without which they cannot live. They'll keep us in power. That was the deal. That was the new economic policy.
Former British communist Harry Young was in Moscow and saw Lenin explain the compromise with capitalism to the party.
He was administering a bitter pill, and they had to take it. And he just very quietly said, we can't go on like this any longer, comrades, in a very quiet, matter-of-fact, business-like way. Lenin spoke to the Congress like a Dutch uncle, or like a granddad speaking to his wayward children. And there was a sort of a subdued hush when people realised that a major transformation had got to take place.
Lenin also banned all splits and factions in the party. It was, he said, no time to have an opposition. Much that was to go wrong later stemmed from this decision.
And I think it happened because of great fear that grew out of the terrible paradox that the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War and lost their support in the country at the very same moment. That the people that had put them in power, the working class, large segments of the intelligentsia, parts of the peasantry, had turned against the party because of the methods that the party had used to win the Civil War. The party was frightened. People said things like, the fate of the Soviet Republic hangs by a hair in 1921. And so the attempt to recast the party into a kind of fortress that could survive this moment came naturally after the Civil War. But it was, of course, nonsense. Nobody paid any attention to it until later, when it became a weapon for Stalin.
I feel as though the notion of a subject is really important when it comes to understanding humanism. And that I want to ask you, like, what do you feel that, like, do you think that one of the differences between you and Postone is that you have a different conception of what the human subject is in general? Like, that you're maybe more Hegelian than Postone, or is that right?
Yeah, there's probably, yeah. I mean, a lot of it comes down to what you think Marxist capital is. Is it a critique of a specific economic form of domination? Or is it a critique of a form of the economic form of domination that, or does it go beyond a critique of an economic form of domination by really critiquing an alienated form of human praxis? And that's how I read capital. I read capital as, here is what happens to the human subject when they're dominated by the value form. Here is what happens to the human subject when it's dominated by capital. Human relationships take on this form of relationships between things. And capital is Marx's effort to tell the working class, this is what happens to you under conditions of capitalist exploitation. It's not just unequal economic conditions and unequal wages. It's not even simply dispossession of your property or your means of production. What really happens is the transformation of your human activity into a reified activity. And it's from that vantage point that Marx is able to, at the same time, articulate the possibility that's intimated in Capital of a reversal of that state of affairs. By that human subjectivity reasserting itself against the domination of capital as it becomes progressively dominated by it. This is what Marx, I view as the subject matter of Capital. So in that sense, I see Capital as it were, Marx's effort to prove what he earlier says in the 1844 manuscripts. 1844 manuscripts has a very wonderful, beautiful conception of human possibility, of subjective liberation, human subject, of humanism, etc. And of course, it's speaking of these things as being threatened by these various dimensions that are now associated in his mind with capitalism. But it's just a declaration, the 1844 manuscripts. There's no positive, rigorous proof of this, right? Capital is the effort to take the claims of 1844 and demonstrate them, pardon the word, scientifically, rigorously, scientifically.
To argue them, I would just think of it as arguing them out, because our understanding of science is kind of constrained.
Yeah, that's why I said it's not the best choice of words, but Marx used that term himself for that reason. Something that's demonstrative. It has to be demonstratively proved. He was a good enough Aristotelian to know what that means. Now, if you're not, so to speak, I don't know how to put it, but I mean, if you're not a humanist to begin with, I mean, if the humanist message of the young Marx doesn't resonate with you, okay, or the kind of vision that's embodied there doesn't resonate with you, you're not going to be attuned to that reading of Capital. So people read Capital based on what they're attuned to, seeing or reading. And so it's not simply a question of what Marx really said, or did you read the passage carefully enough, or blah, 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 which get in all these endless debates. It's also what do you bring to the text in terms of your own conceptual lens. And that my claim is when you bring the conceptual lens of the humanist Marx, the concept of species being, the conception of human possibility, the conception of reification, etc. When you bring as the opposite of that, when you bring these concepts to bear on your reading of Capital, the book really opens up. It's like, wow, this is what's going on. And you see, it's not an economic work per se, even though it appears to be that. It is that in a way, but it's not simply that. It is really a tracing out of a delineation of a form a form of human praxis that is unacceptable, and that ultimately has to be transformed under penalty of death. That's my reading of Capital. Now, it's not the reading of Capital. It's not. Fanon doesn't come with that humanist interpretation.
He comes from the New Left.
Right, he comes from a particular part of the New Left, and it's a particular. See, it's not the early Frankfurt School, right? So he's not coming from the Marcuse of 1941, right? Reason and Revolution, which has much of that strong humanist resonance. And part of the reason he's not is he's oppressively aware, as he should be, that the early Frankfurt School was very poor on political economy. Marcuse wrote the preface to Dostoevsky's first book, Marxism and Freedom. And there's an interesting story as to why he did so. he didn't agree with a lot of the book. He didn't agree with everything that she was saying, but he enthusiastically agreed to write the preface. And that was important for her because she was pretty much unknown in 1958. So to get Marcuse's name preface to a book, of course, opens a lot of doors. Why did he say that he agreed to do the preface? He said to Raya that you're the first person. I know about the dialectic. I know about humanism. I know about the dialectic. I know about these issues in Marx. But you're the first person I've read that's able to show it in Capital. Not only show it in Capital, but show that it's more in Capital than in the early Marx. Now, you see, Pistone was oppressively aware that the Frankfurt School didn't really know political economy that well. And this includes Adorno. Adorno never really gets, brilliant guy and everything, but in his writings, you'll notice it doesn't really get further than exchange value. It really stays at the level of the market. It doesn't really grasp the contours of the system of value production. It's not at that level. So Pistone is reacting against that and trying to bring a more, a reading of Capital that's more in sync with, contemporary critique of political economy. But what's lost in that process is the humanist side of things. And, that's why I say it's not an accident that he just has this blind spot to those tendencies within Marxism that don't fall into his category of traditional Marxism. Because reading Pistone's book, of course, I'm sure you got the sense of this, it's as if everybody who's a traditional Marxist, which is basically anybody but him, right, thinks that private ownership of the means of production, market relations, and circulation is the key to capitalism, and all you need to do is realize industrial labor through planned economy, and you have socialism. And
well, that's a common view. I mean, you can't say that's not a common view.
Oh, no, that's a predominant view. That's why he's right to criticize it. It's a predominant view. This is Monthly Review. There's all the people associated with that school of thought. This is, of course, the Stalinists. This is, of course, Samir Amin. This is, of course, you can mention everybody who's out there, the most biggest names. And, this is where they're, even David Harvey, you can see a lot of this, right? Something like that. But but there's a whole other vein of oppositional current within Marxism, 20th century Marxism, that was pushing in a very, very different direction. And a lot of it was humanist Marxism. But if you're prejudiced against humanist Marxism to begin with and think that what is that, well, I think you're going to suffer in terms of your own ability to grasp really what's going on in Marx's Capital. So that's why I began by saying that, the first thing the JFT did in the 40s, which was, what gave it its right to exist, I guess, at least initially, is they weren't simply doing like a swear word campaign. How should we call the Soviet Union the dirtiest name possible so that people wouldn't think we're associated with it. It really wasn't about that. It was about a project. And James, you got to give him credit, was the one who kind of thought of it first, and Danielskaya then did the work to trace it out. If it's not clear whether society is socialist or capitalist or whatnot, why not answer the question by mapping Marx's Capital onto it and seeing if it corresponds to those categories of capital? If it does, it's capitalist. If it doesn't, it's something else.
So I have a question. You've been talking about blind spots a bit, and Moïse Pistone particularly. But do you think that theorists particularly, get to a certain point and then freeze? That, I interviewed Pistone a couple of times, fairly, not too long before he died, and it is to me personally, it's a real tragedy that he died, because I felt like I was beginning to have a good, just for out of self-interest here, I thought I was beginning to develop a good rapport with him, and that further conversations might have been helpful for me and for my audience, right? I mean, it's really sad that he's gone. I know lots of people who knew him more, who were closer to them than I ever, even would claim at all to be. But do you think that Pistone had already finished his theoretical work before he died? Or do you think that if he continued on for another 10 years, that he might have changed some of his ideas? That these blind spots can be overcome?
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, I did know Moishe personally, and so we had a lot of personal discussions.
I mean, let's just say that Moishe Pistone was theoretically the best kind of person. Like, he was, a saint. Like, yeah, he was a really nice guy. So let's just say that I'm not trying to talk about Pistone's character. I'm talking about, like, how theory is produced.
Yeah, you're raising a really great point, Doug. You see, it's one thing to be able, you develop a theory and then you realize, gee, I missed something. I left something out, or there's a whole area which I didn't take consideration of. It's another thing when you develop a theory and you become beholden to the basic principle of your theory. And that establishes your reputation. That has really made your life. How do you then climb back down that tree and then say, well, it's not just that there's this other material I haven't absorbed yet, or these other arguments I haven't taken account of, but I've got to reconsider whether my basic argument was flawed. That's a very, very hard thing for an intellectual to do. There's something involved in doing theory that's very, I don't always say self-destructive, but it's limiting, right? You reach these discoveries and the whole world opens up before you, through these concepts that you were developing. Mm-hmm. But that very process can very often obscure.
It has to. It always does, right? Because it's always a reductive process.
That's right. There's always going to be an element of that, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very, that's why I think he would have had I think he did have a tough time, and I think he would have had a tough time. I mean, I can't predict the future, what would have happened if he had lived. But I'm just saying, looking back on the 20 years since the publication of the book to now, we know he didn't get to the sequel, right? And I think it would be hard. And it's not just him. I mean, look at anybody who has endnotes. I mean, look at anybody who's coming from that general kind of perspective. What kind of political strategy really follows from their theoretical analysis that they've been able to enunciate? And I can't see much evidence of one.
Right. But I think we're right now in a moment where having a really good political strategy is a problem, not just for people who follow Pistone, but for quite a lot of the left. And frankly, my feeling is, having been through the humanist tradition a little bit, that the humanists aren't in a much better spot to know what to do politically right now.
Well, yes, there's one reason why we separated from News and Letters, because some people, I mean, the group is becoming to the point where just repeating ad nauseum Donetskaya's phrases, or just simply repeating prior political or theoretical conclusions, was like what the group was supposed to do, right? I mean, how do you translate this into actual action and strategy and development, and what would it, right? All those kind of questions have been kind of left aside. And that's a very, very common phenomenon in the left, is that people reach this kind of plateau and then they just want to stay there, right?
Right. Yeah, I call myself a wannabe Marxist. This is what I call myself. This is my own label, that I'm only a wannabe Marxist. And the reason why is because I don't feel like my theoretical view is complete enough. And that, I know that I haven't read all of Marx, so there's that too, right? But also, I feel like that's a fairly good way to stave off, getting limited by your theory, but it's also a really good way to never arrive anywhere. So I'm not sure whether I can really recommend that. Yeah.
But it's not a bad place to be. It's not a bad place to be to say, hey, I'm gonna, I'm getting, like when, it's easy for me to use the word label Marxist humanism, of course, because I've associated myself for many, many years with Marxist humanism. But, there's a lot of, I've seen some people do some really silly things with Marxist humanism, right? Mm-hmm. And there's the whole tradition of Marxist humanism in East Europe. And what happened with that? That's a whole nother story to tell, right? We won't get into here.
Right.
But that really went nowhere, right? I mean, it went worse than nowhere. So, yeah, there are moments too where I'd say, maybe suspend the labels a little bit sometimes. But then again, you can run into the situation, Boots Riley, I don't know if you keep up that.
Yeah, I love Boots Riley. I loved his movie. Yeah.
But he had that line about, what are you, and said, no, I'm a communist,
Right.
And I appreciate that sense in him, right? That he's going to come right out. I'm not just a socialist. I'm a communist. No, I'm not an anti-capitalist. I'm a communist.
Right.
But what does that mean to people? I mean, the word communism.
That means like he wants to send everyone to the gulag. That's right. Yeah.
So we have it's a difficult thing to navigate through all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I sympathize with where you're at. It's that.
And I'm not young. I'm 47. You know, like I'm not a young guy. I'm almost 50, and I feel like
I'm older than you are, and I struggle very hard to make sure I don't get frozen into a position too hard. Right?
Yeah.
Because I'm fully aware. Because I don't. It's there's an awful lot further to go to understand this stuff, and it takes a long time to get to know Marx.